When it comes to the classic Resident Evil games, 2 and 3 are my favourites, even if they're not necessarily the best that the franchise has to offer. Although the original Resident Evil 3, titled Last Escape in Japan and Nemesis pretty much everywhere else, began life as an expansion to Resident Evil 2, it was eventually developed into its own game, becoming a numbered sequel not long after. Chronologically, it takes place before, during, and after the events of Resident Evil 2, and it chronicles STARS officer Jill Valentine's desperate attempt to flee Raccoon City during an outbreak of the T-virus, as well as escape the monstrous beast that stalks her. As a survivor of the Arklay Mountains and Spencer Mansion incident of the first game, Jill already has the skill set needed to survive, but the monster she's faced with is far stronger and much more resilient than the tyrant found in the mansion. When we join her in Nemesis, she has just escaped from her apartment building and is fleeing zombies in the streets, finding her way to a warehouse and another survivor who, predictably, doesn't last long. After this, it's a race to find a way out of the city with Nemesis at every turn, and UBCS, the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, seemingly both hindering and helping her. If you're unfamiliar with the original Resident Evil 3, that is pretty much all you need to know. Although there's little in the way of plot development for the overall Resident Evil franchise, its heavy focus on Jill, her survival, and her increasing weariness with the relentless Nemesis that makes this game so enjoyable. If you haven't played Nemesis, I would urge you to do so. Although I will say it's always somewhat amused me how one of the central conflicts of the game at around its midway point became the foundation for easily the most maligned aspect of Resident Evil 5. I'm going to try to keep this video reasonably concise, although future me, going into recording this now, can see that that really didn't happen. I'd like to do a more thorough analysis at a later date, so this video will be spoiler free. If you're just interested in whether or not the remake is worth playing, I would say yes if you've never played the original, and potentially no if you have. 2020's Resident Evil 3 is more similar to Silent Hill Shattered Memories, where it's closer to a reimagining of the game it's based on rather than a faithful remake like last year's predecessor, Resident Evil 2. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that the remake of Resi 2 was an excellent game, but suffered some unfortunate flaws, largely in the lacking mobility and the disappointing B scenarios, which were only barely altered from the A scenarios compared to the original game. And thankfully, Resident Evil 3 has fixed one of those things. There's a dodge button now. Yay. It would be unfair to criticise this year's remake for its presentation and actual gameplay. Like 2 before it, 3 makes fantastic use of Capcom's proprietary RE engine, responsible for the visual feasts of Resident Evil 7 and Devil May Cry 5. And it would be extremely difficult to make a mess of the atmosphere that oozed from every pore of Resi 2. The game looks and feels excellent, with the fully rendered locations of long-beloved Raccoon City dripping with character and life. Key locales, particularly storefronts, are gorgeous in their appearance. Neon lights, hideous quintessentially American figureheads adorning the rooftops, red brick buildings caught between a slowly increasing capitalist society that seem strangely out of place, like relics of a time slowly receding into the last century. It's a believable, realistic interpretation of Raccoon City, at least in looks, but we'll get to the downsides in due time. There are certain parts of the game where its dedication to letting you soak in the atmosphere recaptures the brilliance of last year's release, where the streets of the city and the accompanying chase make it difficult to appreciate just how well constructed environments and the sound design are. 2 areas in particular, roughly halfway through the game, are a joy to explore. The natural ambience of these areas is greatly accentuated when you can just wander around and explore, soaking in the darkness and enjoying the masterful presentation. In terms of gameplay, there's little that's changed from Resi 2's heavily refined mechanics. Movement is still fast and fluid. There's a good deal of tension in balancing your distance from the enemies and your aim as you make the most of the limited resources at your disposal, especially on harder difficulties. Headshots carry a chance of a critical hit, allowing you to destroy enemies in one shot, but downing a zombie is not guaranteed to mean it won't get up again at some point if you do miss a critical. The tension, therefore, is largely a result of this uncertainty, of the constant scavenging for supplies, picking and choosing your moments to shoot, and eventually in deciding whether to actually deal with the enemies before you or make a tactical retreat. Including the ability to dodge is a much needed addition, and unlike the original game, it's a lot more reliable, being assigned a dedicated button with a promise of movement instead of the faint hope, even if you're not guaranteed to completely avoid damage. Being able to dodge at all makes up for many of the shortcomings of Resi 2's combat, or the combat in the Resident Evil franchise in general. It's always been a point of contention that these highly trained officers couldn't work out how to move away at a moment's notice, instead of just awkwardly spinning on the spot and tanking away. The redesign of the core characters, namely Jill, Carlos and Nemesis, is a pleasant surprise. Although Nemesis's delightful gnashers were a huge distraction in early press releases, I'm pleased to say that you don't have to suffer them for too long. And even in the early stages of his appearance, where those pearly whites are on full display, it's rare you'll be standing close enough to appreciate them before you're pummeled into the ground. Nemesis's visual overhaul, like the two main characters, is minimal in design and more a way to enjoy the upgrade in graphical fidelity that we've enjoyed in the last 21 years, since the original game was released. Seeing Nemesis fully realised in Capcom's RE engine is a feast for the eyes, and he's no less sinister than he was originally. Like Mr. X before him, he's huge and hulking, towering over Jill and capable of dealing massive amounts of damage in very few hits. His moveset is also improved, with him being able to snatch you from greater distances with his tentacle thing, as well as leap around the map to his heart's content, dropping down in front of you whenever he fancies it. Perfecting a dodge against him takes a little effort, and it can sometimes feel like you're taking unfair damage when a dodge that looks like it should have avoided him sees you clip from behind. Still, the game is geared towards having you run from him for the vast majority of its first third, taking great pains to show you how overwhelmingly powerful Nemesis is in its somewhat contrived intro sequence, but again, we'll get to that. As for Jill and Carlos, the latter's redesign and characterisation is considerably better than Jill's, and I'm not talking about clothing, let's just accept the fact that trousers are easier to run in the skirts and move on, yeah? Regardless, Carlos feels like a more realistic character, easier to empathise with. He still wisecracks, but he's no longer as playfully dismissive as he used to be, knowing exactly when to stay serious and when to break the ice. In fact, I would go so far as to say he's criminally underused in the game, although this is partly the result of the fact that the game is very short. His character growth is unusually rapid, compressed as a result of the short runtime, but it's no less believable. And his reactions to having his illusions of Umbrella shattered before him are restrained but entirely sympathetic. He's well voiced and well acted, and when you take control of him at a particular key point of the game, he has some excellent sarcastic dialogue and cold observations of the world around him, making him feel vastly more fleshed out than the other characters. On the other hand, Jill's characterisation is a little hit or miss. I've often thought that Jill is one of the characters in the franchise who's almost never looked or been acted the same way more than once. In the original PS1 game, terrible voice acting aside, she's a young, slightly headstrong go-getter, with clear reverence for Barry Burton and a relatively jovial attitude. In the remake of that game, she's similarly cast, but also a little more fresh-faced, clearly much more set aback at the situation she's in. But as she progresses through the narrative and her illusions of Stars and Barry in particular are twisted, she becomes more sure of herself and her abilities, becoming the jaded survivor with absolutely no chill that we play as in Nemesis.
Why isn't someone doing something about this?
In Revelations, she exists. I'm not going to lie, I can't comment much on her character in Revelations because I've tried very hard to forget that the game exists because I hated it. And in Resident Evil 5, she spends the short period of time she's actually in the game reminding us that Chris is the messiah of the world and the only one who could possibly stop Wesker. Thankfully, like Carlos, Jill is equally as reserved and cautious as she is wisecracking. Although restrained at first, she does warm to Carlos and becomes much more open and relaxed with him, enough to move away from insulting him at every turn to cracking an honest smile at his attempts to cheer her up. She's certainly not the wary, somewhat meek young Stars recruit from the Spencer Mansion incident, and the opening of the game suggests that time spent trapped in her apartment have greatly fed her paranoia as she dedicates sleepless nights to trying to bring down Umbrella once and for all. Even so, she's quick to forego her own safety and allay her concerns over Umbrella's machinations to ensure that she helps save as many civilians as possible. Having said that, she is also one hell of a potty mouth in this game. Don't get me wrong, the first thing most people would do in a situation like this would be to swear like a trooper, and this was updated in the Resi 2 Remake's dialogue to make it more human, better representative of how real people would discuss this madness with each other. But at the same time, it can sometimes feel a bit excessive, and I say that as someone who swears a lot.
Fucking hell. What the fuck? Shit!
It's my turn, bitch!
Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? You guys are the ones who caused all of this. Fuck you.
You know that feeling when you're working behind your desk at your retail job and someone has their phone set up on the Bluetooth speaker but they forget to play songs with no swearing, so every time there's a curse word it feels like it's being deliberately bellowed into the shop compared to the rest of the lyrics? No, just me? Also, this game absolutely revels in beating the ever-living hell out of Jill, and it's frankly laughable how often she falls off things, rolls down things, gets thrown to one side, falls through holes. It's a wonder she has any teeth left to smile. What really lets this game down is twofold. Its narrative and its set pieces. From the off, Nemesis was designed to be more action-focused than its predecessor back in '98, but it utilised Nemesis himself as a strong opposition to the otherwise more gung-ho nature of the game. Where you could spend all day mowing down zombies with your assault rifle or grenade launcher or whatever you happen to have to hand, Nemesis had a persistence and resilience that was the perfect reminder that not everything can be solved with bullets, and his relentless pursuit provided an excellent balance to that action. The problem with this game is that Nemesis is so often part of the explosive, over-the-top action set pieces that his purpose is almost completely lost, and the game forgoes any real sense of urgency and terror at the sight of him, every time it drags you into what essentially boils down to a glorified QuickTime event. The game's intro is the perfect example of this. It's been created from scratch for the remake, and sees Jill waking up in her apartment after a nightmare sequence, receiving a phone call from Brad Vickers, another STARS member, who warns her that she needs to get out of the city, before Nemesis himself promptly busts down the walls, kicks the shit out of her and proceeds to chase her through a fiery apartment complex. You're then corralled through a heavily scripted sequence filled with explosions, flames, and Jill being thrown around a lot before winding up on the roof of a car park, where you then proceed to get in a car, press a button and ram Nemesis off the roof. It's completely ridiculous. And whilst it serves the purpose of showing you just how outmatched you are against Nemesis, to prepare you for the next hour or so you'll spend running from him, it's so completely over the top that it creates an expectation for this game being little more than one action set piece after another. Combined with its invincible protagonist, it feels like the intro to a particularly bloody Uncharted game. The OTT intro is totally at odds with how the game feels when it works in tandem with its gorgeous visuals and excellent atmosphere, and this conflict of tone persists throughout the entire game. There is no attempt at building any tension or atmosphere, not deliberate at least. We see a quick sequence in the beginning of Nemesis being prepared and transported, and then there he is, busting through your wall like a very determined landlord, guns akimbo and ready to smash. The total absence of build-up and the 0 to 100 method of introducing Nemesis does nothing to identify him as a terrifying powerhouse of a villain. Instead, it puts you in the mindset of running away from him until you come across an obvious set piece, where you can then be safe in the knowledge that you might at most have to push 1 or 2 buttons to get away from him. It ruins that seeping dread that Nemesis was so adept at in the original game, and turns one of the franchise's most interesting and unique villains into what basically boils down to an overgrown gargoyle. Without that important build-up that was present in the original, with Nemesis gradually growing in size and power and appearing at very irregular intervals just to mess with you, the fundamental feeling of scavenging Raccoon City for a way to escape it is drowned in the feeling that all you're doing is delaying the inevitable kick the shit out of Jill cutscene. It is a huge waste of the potential that we saw in Mr. X, and it's a shame that the concept of Nemesis was tossed aside in favour of promoting the action aspects of the original game, rather than the core villain that it was named for. Speaking of Nemesis being introduced right out of the gate, this remake is missing a good third of the original game's narrative and exploration. Although Nemesis begins with Jill escaping her apartment, it takes quite some time before she comes across Carlos, and even longer before she manages to fix and board the train. In the remake, you are rescued by Carlos 10 minutes in, and are then tasked not with finding supplies to get the train running, but just with fixing the electrical substation. The encounter with Brad is there, but it's extremely brief and lacks any kind of punch. He doesn't even die to Nemesis outside of RPD the way he did originally, which back then served as Jill's first opportunity to fight Nemesis and learn his methods and patterns. There's barely any downtown section, no newspaper office, no diner battle, no real interaction with the garage, no park, no clock tower, and no water/waste disposal facility. A huge portion of the game's explorative sections have been completely removed, and as a result, the city feels so constrained and gutted that it just isn't enjoyable to explore because there's nothing to see. The loving recreation of the RPD office in Resi 2 spoke volumes of the team's love and reverence for the original game, but in this remake, the determination to focus almost solely on action set pieces means that much of what made the original game, and Nemesis by extension, so tense, has been completely removed. There's barely anything in the way of actually searching for an escape, since much of it is set in stone by UBCS and you're just sent out to do what they ask you to. There are no choices to be made, and deciding to go one way first doesn't lock out a different path that would otherwise have assisted in replayability. Because of this, the live selection process is gone, and the minuscule proportions of Raccoon City means that memorising the map is not worth it at all. In exchange, there are greatly expanded sections where you play as Carlos, and these are easily the best parts of the game because they are the sections where the atmosphere can be enjoyed. There's far fewer enemies, meaning you rarely see the same copy-pasted zombie over and over, and the game's natural beauty allows you to take a breather from all the redundant explosions you've put up with so far. Even then, this is ruined by the final section of Carlos's gameplay, which I won't spoil, but let's just say it's a deeply unsatisfying conclusion to his otherwise fairly enjoyable arc. And there's a sewer section, because of course there's a bloody sewer section. Furthermore, the plot has been streamlined to better fit in with the canon of Resi 2, something that was contentious at best in the original, as well as a greatly expanded explanation for the presence of a vaccine for the T-virus, which in the original game was pretty much just sitting about in the local hospital for anyone to grab. Whilst it's appreciated and it does make the narrative feel like it has higher stakes than just Jill and Carlos's survival, so much has been sacrificed to highlight this streamlined plot that it barely feels worth it. A lot of criticism has also been aimed at Nemesis becoming a set piece, but I don't think this is really the issue. He becomes a set piece in the original game after a certain point as well. The problem is that he doesn't get even remotely enough time to enjoy his experience in the spotlight as what is supposed to be the heart of the game. Nemesis was built to relentlessly stalk the remaining STARS members and would do so regardless of how often he was down. But because the narrative and the city have been heavily condensed, he has almost no room to breathe and exercise this. Whilst he does stalk you through the streets for a short while, it's only the faintest glimpse of what could have been, because from the moment you get the substation online to the moment you return to the train, he has maybe 5 or 10 minutes chasing you around, depending on how quickly you get things done. It's just not enough to really explore the full extent of his power and capabilities. And with Nemesis now being the only boss to carry over from the original game, this makes his impact so minimal as to be pointless. This remake is a huge waste of potential, but that doesn't mean it has no value at all. There are brief glimpses of what made the RE2 remake brilliant, and there are certain moments where Nemesis is just as horrifying as he was originally. Playing as Carlos was far more enjoyable than I expected, the music was excellent, it looks and plays great, the voice acting was adequate, and although totally cheesy, the decision to keep Jill's infamous line in the game was appreciated. I will say that I thoroughly enjoyed the fights with both Stage 1 and Stage 3 Nemesis, the latter of which is greatly altered from the original game, and aspects of the story that had been streamlined were for the better, with it making far more sense for there to be a desire to make better use of the vaccine than its brief appearance in the original game. But the tonal discrepancies and how ridiculous the action gets ruin what could have been a fantastic recreation of the series' most beloved monster. Underused enemies that appear once and are instantly thrown away, a pointless sewer section, the gutting of the story and the city itself, and the decision to introduce Nemesis far too quickly means that the game falls flat on its face in terms of its worth to the overall Resident Evil franchise. As I said earlier, if you've never played the original, then you likely won't have half as many issues as those who are overly familiar with it. And if you have played the original, then I would suggest you think of this game not as a remake, but as a different interpretation of Nemesis. As Shattered Memories was to Silent Hill 1, this is a game with a lot of promise and some genuinely brilliant moments, lost to other deeply frustrating issues and underutilised enemies, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how to build and maintain fear and tension. It's not a bad game. It's a good game. But that's all it is, and after the past few years and Capcom's steady output of excellent games, the fact that Resident Evil 3 is just adequate is a true shame. I really wanted to love this game. September 28th. Daylight. The monsters have overtaken the city. Somehow, I'm still alive. What are you doing? I'm making a record of our progress before the virus kills us all, obviously. Right, well, can you keep it down? Because I'm trying to film a review of the new Resident Evil 3 remake thing. That guy over there, he looks suspicious. He looks infected. He's not infected. Never fear. I will protect us. That is literally a cosplay sword. So, it's blunt. Well, do you have a whetstone? Although Nemesis is... Nemesis is... But the tonal discrepancies and how religious the action gets, fuck me.